This video is intended to give you a background on the history and politics of refugee resettlement. If you are preparing to attend a meeting of the annual Tripartite Consultations on Resettlement, this video will be particularly interesting to you in helping you understand the context within which conversations on the global governance of resettlement take place. Refugee resettlement is a critically important area of activity within the global refugee regime. But despite its importance, it remains conditioned by the politics of the refugee regime itself, as you will have seen in an earlier video. This is an area of activity within UNHCR that's changed quite a bit over the past 30 years. And many of the people involved in refugee settlement, certainly from the civil society perspective, are individuals that have remained involved in this area of work for many decades. So understanding the history and understanding the politics will be important as you develop your advocacy points in how you would like to engage in advancing the practice of refugee resettlement. There are a few things that we're going to cover in this short lecture. The first is to say, what is this thing called refugee resettlement? You may have heard about it quite a bit, but actually, when we look at the specifics of it, what is this thing supposed to do? And who is involved in refugee resettlement? And what power do these individual actors have in the process as a whole? We also want to understand why this act is so political. On the one hand, refugee resettlement is a very bureaucratic process of identifying refugees in need of settlement, of their needs coming to the attention of a country willing to offer resettlement, and the process of providing documentation, medical, security clearance, booking an airline ticket, and that individual then traveling to another country. But as we'll see in this lecture, all of these activities, which are bureaucratic and humanitarian, take place within an intensely political environment. The political environment is a product of history, a history of more than 60 years of refugee resettlement being one of a competing set of priorities within global refugee responses. And it's only within the last 30 years or so that refugee resettlement activities have been governed in a way to try and promote more collective action. So it's within this that we'll try and understand how refugee resettlement is supposed to work, and the critical issues that face discussions on refugee resettlement today. So let's start at the beginning. What is refugee settlement? More than 20 years ago, UNHCR's Executive Committee defined resettlement as the making available in a third country on a voluntary basis permanent residence to a refugee who is in another country in a manner where the resettled person enjoys rights similar to nationals. So there's some key elements in that. Not only is refugee resettlement about a refugee moving from the country where they have refuge in their country of first asylum to a third country. So, for example, a South Sudanese refugee in Kenya is identified for resettlement to Canada. They physically then move from Kenya to Canada. So it's not just that process of movement. Some key elements is it's voluntary. There is no legal obligation for states to make available resettlement opportunities. In an earlier lecture, you would have heard about the key obligations of states towards refugees not to forcibly return them to a country where they fear persecution. You would have also heard about the recognition that refugee situations cannot be resolved without international cooperation. So there's a legal obligation on states to not forcibly return refugees, and there is a normative commitment on states to cooperate. There is no legal obligation for a third country to accept refugees for resettlement. So anything a country does to support refugee resettlement is voluntary. second, it's also important to understand that it involves a third country in that process. So this isn't the host country, it isn't the country of origin. So this is a third country solution. So that's the example of a South Sudanese refugee in Kenya, or a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, or a refugee from Sierra Leone in Ghana, for example. These are countries where a refugee has fled their country of origin. They're in a country of asylum. The idea of resettlement is that it involves a third country becoming involved. The fourth point is that it's not just that they are relocated on a basis. Throughout history, there have been moments of temporary evacuation. But the idea of resettlement is that it's a process that leads to a permanent solution, that they are able to enjoy rights at a level similar to nationals. Typically, this involves a pathway to citizenship. So when we think of resettlement, it's the transfer of refugees from a country of asylum to a third country, not to their country of origin, that's repatriation, but the transfer of refugees to a third country, and for that transfer to involve a pathway to enjoying rights. So in this, one of the three durable solutions that's made available within the refugee regime. A refugee can return to their country of origin voluntarily, that's repatriation. They can gain citizenship in the country where they are a refugee, naturalization or local integration, or they can find a solution in a third country, refugee resettlement. So this is very much part of the suite of solutions made available within the refugee regime. It has a very particular political history within the workings of UNHCR as an organization. So on the one hand, it's clearly within UNHCR's statute. When UNHCR was created by the UN General Assembly, it was created to serve this function. And so this is a reminder from what you would have heard in an earlier lecture. One of UNHCR's two core functions is to seek permanent solutions for refugees. And one of the ways that it can find a permanent solution is by supporting a process of assimilating refugees within new national communities. Now, that new national community can be the country where a refugee has sought asylum. So in the case of a South Sudanese refugee in Kenya, it might be one day that Kenya citizenship or permanent residence to the Sudanese refugee. But if that South Sudanese refugee is selected for resettlement to Canada, the process by which they are assimilated, that gain those durable rights within Canada. But critical within this is UNHCR cannot do resettlement on its own. UNHCR cannot do resettlement on its own. UNHCR does not of saying, Canada, you take these refugees. United States, you take these refugees. Australia, Norway, etc. UNHCR cannot do that. Resettlement is a voluntary act by states. And what UNHCR is mandated to do is to assist governments when they voluntarily choose to do this. UNHCR is also mandated to work with private organizations subject to the approval of the government concerned in identifying refugees, in the travel of resettled refugees, in the reception and in the integration of refugees. So critical in all of this is that UNHCR does not have the mandate or the power to say who should be resettled. Also important increasingly is that resettlement is not just about a country like Canada saying that it wants to identify South Sudan in Kenya. The Kenyan state also plays a role. And we have seen this, for example, in efforts to advance resettlement needs of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has asserted its sovereignty by saying that it's not going to issue exit permits for refugees. And we'll talk a little bit later on in this lecture about why that might be. So resettlement is undertaken by a group of actors. UNHCR has no mandate to resettle refugees, but UNHCR has developed a function in resettlement. UNHCR has a function to identify refugees who are in need of resettlement, to prepare a dossier of that resettlement need, the refugee resettlement form. UNHCR submits these applications for resettlement to resettlement countries. But UNHCR isn't the only actor that identifies refugees for resettlement. Some governments do that work on their own. Some governments rely on community members within their own country to identify refugees in need of resettlement. So UNHCR isn't the only entry point into resettlement, but it's a very important one. So UNHCR has developed a function to identify refugees in need of resettlement and to prepare and submit such files of such refugees to resettlement countries. UNHCR also plays a bit of a role, though less of a role, in facilitating the integration of resettled refugees into their new countries. But more critically, for what we're going to discuss, and more critically for those of you preparing to attend the annual Tripartite Consultations on Resettlement, is that UNHCR has developed a function to facilitate the global governance of refugee resettlement, to try and bring all of these actors involved in refugee resettlement together to try and harmonize policies and procedures, to bring all of these disparate actors together to talk about how resettlement should happen. Now, this raises the question of why refugee resettlement is political. Resettlement is at the discretion of states. And not just any states. There are, at the ATCR, in any given year, between about 20 and 30 states in the world that offer refugee resettlement. Some countries have very small resettlement programs. So countries, relatively new resettlement countries, like countries in Latin America, like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, they have resettlement programs that measure in hundreds in any given year. The top resettlement countries, the countries that have most power in refugee resettlement, because they offer opportunities in a voluntary way, are countries in North America, like Canada and the United States, in Oceania, like Australia and New Zealand, and in Northern Europe, countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These are the countries that play a very significant role because of the power they have. They do something on a voluntary basis. And the voluntariness of that means that it can be taken away if they don't like the way that it's done. Think, for example, of the history and the ebb and flow of the U.S. resettlement program. Prior to 2015, the United States was resettled somewhere in the area 90 to 100,000 refugees a year. Then under the Trump administration, that number was cut to 18 to 20,000 a year. And it's only now that we see in under the Biden administration how that is sort of being ramped back up. So for a country to say, no, we're not going to do resettlement anymore. And the fact that without the participation of these countries, there would be no resettlement, gives a very particular group of countries a great deal of power in deciding how resettlement will happen. This is also important because of the massive gap between those refugees who need settlement and the resettlement spaces available. In any given year, UNHCR estimates that there's somewhere in the area of 1.5 million refugees in need of. There are 8 to 10 million refugees who are eligible for resettlement, but about 1.5 million refugees a year who are in urgent need of resettlement. But resettlement countries only make available in the area of 100 to 150,000 resettlement places a year. And there's nothing UNHCR can do about that. The UN Secretary General has called for countries to increase their resettlement opportunities. UNHCR calls on countries to increase their resettlement opportunities. But in any given year, only about 1 out of every 100 refugees who are eligible for resettlement will be resettled. And what this means is that resettlement is an incredibly scarce resource. And that makes it very political. When you're managing this incredibly scarce resource, who decides how that's going to work is incredibly important. It's also incredibly political within UNHCR. UNHCR, an organization, doesn't have an even view of what they think about refugee resettlement. That there are some within UNHCR who feels that settlement, because it's such a scarce resource, that it becomes a distraction for UNHCR. Why invest time and resources in a solution that's only going to benefit 150,000 refugees a year when you have millions of refugees in need of a resettlement, in need of a solution? There are some who say that refugee resettlement becomes a distraction. As soon as refugee resettlement is introduced into a field operation, it takes energy and attention away from core activities of protection, assistance, and other solutions. There's a view that once resettlement becomes part of a UNHCR operation, that UNHCR becomes a travel agency, that UNHCR's job is facilitating those who want to move to another country. This stereotype, this misperception of resettlement plays a fundamentally important role in understanding how resettlement sits within UNHCR as an organization, and how those who are advocates for refugee resettlement, those who gather for the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement, are not only trying to convince governments of cooperating, they're often trying to convince their own UNHCR colleagues on the way that refugee resettlement plays a critical and complementary role in the exercise of UNHCR's wider mandate. And this misperception of refugee resettlement has deep political roots and deep historical roots. When UNHCR was established in the aftermath of World War II, it had a competitor. For about 3 years, 2 organizations existed side by side. One was UNHCR, and one was the International Refugee Organization. The role of the International Refugee Organization was exclusively to identify refugees among the 55 million people placed in Europe after World War II and expediting them for resettlement to Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, to other countries that were working to rebuild their economies after World War II and address labor shortages. So from the very beginning, resettlement was seen as something that was in competition with UNHCR. There was also the feeling that refugee resettlement privileged those who had an economic contribution to make. Have a look at this picture of refugees departing for resettlement in early days after World War II, and you see that there's a very particular type of refugee, of a very particular age, of a very particular demographic. There was this image in the early 1950s that resettlement for those who were white, working age, young, able-bodied, and they were selected for resettlement because of the perceived contribution they could make to the country where they were settled. For 10 years, this approach to resettlement happened until the critique was made that this approach to resettlement left behind those with protection needs, those with disabilities, those with medical needs. And it wasn't until 1959, in something called World Refugee Year, that there was a concerted international effort to shift solutions for refugees away from responding to the economic needs of countries that would see refugees, on resettled refugees, but to focus these activities on the basis of needs of the individual who needed a solution. But that created a very strong image or trope of refugee settlement. Refugee resettlement as being that benefited a privileged few, and refugee resettlement that furthered the political and economic interests of the countries that were doing the resettlement. And this trope, this image of resettlement, was only reinforced through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, as refugee resettlement was used as part of the politic of the early Cold War period, when the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies were locked in this geopolitical, ideological struggle. During that time, refugee resettlement was used as a way of highlighting the limitations of communist regimes. After the Hungarian uprising, after uprisings in different places that were crushed by communist regimes, those who could flee were happily resettled to the United States as proof of the importance of the Cold War and the need to continue this ideological struggle, that those who fled were voting with their feet against communism. And so this pro-refugee resettlement being an extension of the politics of the country doing the resettlement, as opposed to a response to the needs of those being resettled, was a very important image that was actually reinforced by one of the biggest moments of resettlement history, which is the resettlement of refugees fleeing Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia after 1975. This is probably the historical moment that has done the most to shape refugee resettlement. Many senior resettlement officials, whether in NGOs, in UNHCR, even government, chances are very good that if they're in their late 50s, early 60s, chances are very good they probably got their start working on refugee resettlement at the time of the Indo-Chinese CPA. And what happened was in 1965, Saigon, in South Vietnam, it fell, and U.S. troops were evacuated, and that was the end of the Vietnam War. But in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon, there was this fear of retaliation against those in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia, who had supported the U.S. war effort in Vietnam, that they would be persecuted, and people began to flee. And it was a time where news media was becoming very prominent, and these images, such as the ones you see on your screen of individuals fleeing small boats, really caught the attention of the U.S. public, saying, that's our fault. We ran away from Vietnam's ability to do something. So in 1979, there was an agreement in Geneva about a commitment to those who were found to be refugees, those who fled from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia and arrived in countries like Thailand, like Malaysia, that they would be resettled to other countries. This became then formalized 10 years later in 1999 in the Comprehensive Plan of Action. The Constitution went right until 1995. And during this period of 20 years, from 1975 to 95, some 3 million refugees fled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Almost 2 million of those refugees settled to other countries. 1.25 million refugees settled to the United States alone. So on the one hand, it was a very successful example of how resettlement could be used to respond to a very complex refugee situation. Some said maybe it was too successful. It was too successful because it led to this existential crisis of UNHCR. That UNHCR there not to ensure protection, but just to ensure that these large numbers of individuals were passed through the system. Some within UNHCR said, where are we exercising our protection mandate if our only job is as individuals arrive that we process them and send them off to the United States? And this led to a 2-year review. When the CPA ended in 1995, it led to a 2-year review within on how the organization was going to deal with resettlement. How was it going to see resettlement with its mandate? What would resettlement have within the organization? What we have as guidelines and procedures for resettlement today have their origins in this review of refugee resettlement in the mid-1990s. To understand why we approach resettlement the way we do today, we have to understand the political context within which these rules and procedures were first established. Because the end of the Indo-Chinese CPA brought in this era of resettlement for UNHCR. This conversation about how UNHCR's role would be performed, really in trying to understand how resettlement relates to questions of legal protection and how resettlement activities could be harmonized. That UNHCR didn't want a situation where there were 20 different countries asking for 20 different kinds of forms and applying 20 different definitions of who was eligible for resettlement. And one of the major outcomes of this process was the publication of UNHCR's Resettlement Handbook. It's gone through many iterations from 1997 to today. It's gone through at least 5 major. But the core of the Resettlement Handbook today is the same as it was in 1997. That it contained a set of standards of who is eligible for resettlement. UNHCR was successful in getting the settlement countries of the day to agree that priority should be given to urgent protection cases, cases of family reunification, women, children at risk, refugees with medical disabilities, and refugees without an alternate durable solution. So about who's eligible for resettlement today, that understanding, those eligibility criteria, those were established aftermath of this free-for-all during the Indo-Chinese process. It also, in the first handbook, established the notion of how refugee resettlement was a process that was integrated into what UNHCR does. That refugee resettlement was deemed as something that began when someone was determined to be a refugee, is resettlement issue that needed to be taken into account at that time. And it also established a process by which every country participating in resettlement would share with everyone else plans were for resettlement in a given year. So this idea of resettlement being seen as an area of collective action, where on a voluntary countries contribute what they're able to do, but share that information with each other so that everyone knows what are the priorities for different countries, what are the numbers for different countries. So there are 2 halves to the Resettlement Handbook. There's the Resettlement Handbook that talks about eligibility and process. Who's eligible and what are the steps for identifying who's eligible for resettlement, who's a priority case for resettlement, and how that resettlement submission will be prepared. The second half of the handbook are the country chapters that talk about the refugee resettlement spaces and the priority of a particular country in a particular year. The handbook was the first significant result of a new approach to governing resettlement, which started in 1995 as the annual Tripartite Consultations on Resettlement, an annual meeting when resettlement countries, NGOs from that country, and UNHCR would meet to try and discuss the priorities for the year ahead and to take stock of what had been accomplished. So it's incredible to think that, unlike UNHCR's executive committee that was established in 1958 and has been running for decades, and that includes more than 100 countries, the annual Tripartite Consultations on Resettlement, the ATCR, is a relative newcomer in the governance of the global refugee regime. It involves a smaller number of fewer states, right? Only about 20 to 30 countries in every year, as opposed to the 100 that arrive for XCOM. That UNHCR's role within this is sort of co-managing this with states and NGOs. There's a process by which country takes a turn every year to chair ATCR along with the NGO community within that country with UNHCR. And it's possibly for this reason, because it's so relatively new and because it is a smaller number of states, is one of the reasons why the ATCR has become one of the most innovative sites of governance within the refugee regime. And this has enabled the ATCR process to go through a fairly remarkable agenda in a relatively short period of time. Through the late 1990s, from 1995 through the end of the 1990s, the challenge there and the goal was establishing this process and a shared understanding of eligibility criteria. There was a real emphasis on building confidence between states that contribute to resettlement and within UNHCR. By the time we got to the late 1990s, the early 2000s, at a time when I was attending UNHCR, as someone working within UNHCR's resettlement team, when I was attending ATCR, there was a real focus on ensuring the integrity of the resettlement process. In 2002, 2003, there was a very significant event where UNHCR employees in Nairobi were found to have been participating in a scheme to sell resettlement spaces to the highest bidder. This created a number of concerns about fraud, the integrity of the resettlement process. Also in the early 2000s was a realization of a lack of a coherent methodology in identifying where there were resettlement needs, not just in particular countries of interest, but regardless of the country context. And the process of identifying needs and identifying where there was capacity to do resettlement was the origins of the first UNHCR Global Needs Report, which was in the early 2000s. By the time we get to the 2010s, there's this effort on trying to expand the base of resettlement countries, going beyond the traditional countries of Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Northern European countries. So the introduction of Latin American resettlement countries, Southern European countries as resettlement countries. But also, by the time we get to the late 2010s, is a time where there was this conversation of complementary pathways. It was in the 2010s that UNHCR first mooted this idea of migration as a possible solution, migration to fill labor market needs. And so remember, the very early origins of resettlement was to address post-World War II labor needs in countries. So then there was this move to a protection focus in the 1990s. And so coming back to sort of a battle of both protection and labor market needs was something that was quite important in resettlement discussions in 2018, 2019. And today, there's very much a focus on being even more innovative in the way that refugee is governed. Since 2021, the work of the Refugee Advisory Group in really making real commitments to refugee participation in the governance of the refugee regime, as you will have heard in other lectures and guest talks, the most and critical sites of innovation in the governance of the refugee regime as a whole. This work that ATCR in 25 years is quite extraordinary and far outstrips the making that UNHCR's executive committee has been able to undertake. Whether or not you agree with it all, the fact is it shows how R is a very important site. It's a very important moment where this group of states with UNHCR and NGOs and refugees come to get decisions on how they're going to manage this incredibly scarce resource. And this leads us to the critical issue in refugee resettlement today. There are many, 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 many issues. The idea of privilege and preferencing, but I believe that we can sort of think about three baskets of issues that really define the resettlement today. The first is the politics of resettlement. You know, the changes in the U.S. resettlement program, because the United States used to resettle more refugees than all other countries in the world combined. Politics of the U.S. resettlement program has really become the politics of resettlement as a whole. Within this of the preferences of resettlement is this question of why there are certain refugee situations that attract more attention when it comes to resettlement, this notion of non-discrimination in the resettlement process. Why are there pathways made available for certain nationalities of refugees than others? Why is it that there are faster processing times in some regions of the world compared to others? And that has to do with the political of those countries that make available resettlement on a voluntary basis. There's also the politics of resettlement within UNHCR. Countries that are gearing up for large repatriation opportunities or large repatriation programs will often be very reluctant to support refugee resettlement programming because of the fear that refugees will not repatriate if there's opportunity to be resettled. Now, you know better than I that is, but yet it's that image that remains. There's the moral hazard resettlement. Why do we invest time and resource in a solution that benefits a relatively small number of refugees? But also increasingly, we're realizing that we can't take the political priorities that host refugees, we can't ignore those preferences. So how countries like Bangladesh play a critical role in impeding refugee resettlement efforts. So that's one basket of issues. Then during politics of resettlement, there's also a basket about from resettlement as one particular area of activity to this wider conversation about third country solutions. Last few years, we've seen a particular growth in this notion of complementary pathways, that if refugee resettlement is a resource available to 150,000 refugees a year with a priority given to those with urgent protection needs, what about all the other refugees who have skills that they can contribute to a new country? Why can't they find a solution, not through refugee settlement, but through labor market pathways, labor complementary pathways through labor streams or education? So there's this whole discussion now about what are the other immigration tools that have nothing to do with refugee protection. Why are refugees limited to the refugee stream as opposed to using labor market stream as a way of addressing labor market shortages, opportunities for refugees? You know, in the Canadian context, for example, the province of Nova Scotia has a significant shortage of workers. It has engaged in conversations, for example, in the Kakuma refugee camp about can it recruit healthcare workers who happen to be in need of a solution, and there's a win-win. Refugee finds a solution, labor market needs in Nova Scotia are addressed. But remember the politics of resettlement from the very early days. This makes some very uncomfortable, feeling that it puts the emphasis of resettlement back on the economic priorities of countries, not the protection needs of refugees. And then the last question, this activity is governed. Refugee resettlement is a voluntary act by states. There is no requirement to engage in refugee resettlement. But yet resettlement is going to be more efficient and more effective if these efforts. So to ask the question of who's present in these conversations about governance, the important, critical role refugees have played in pushing the agenda on refugee resettlement. The whole question of complementary pathways and labor mobility as a solution to refugees would not have moved forward were it not for refugee-led initiatives that made the argument that it could be reconciled with resettlement as a protection tool, as a durable solution, and as a solidarity. So this notion of refugee participation, if there's anywhere in the refugee regime where the substantive value of refugee participation has been demonstrated, it's in innovations in the governance of refugee resettlement and in the evolution of global policy on resettlement. We all need to ask the question, who is absent from discussions on refugee resettlement? Where are host countries? Where are refugees in countries of first asylum? How can a better understanding of all of the actors that are involved in resettlement, how can that make better? So that was my effort I've fallen well short of trying to do that in half an hour, but that to try and take all of these questions about refugee resettlement and to bring them together in an introductory lecture. I hope you found it useful. I hope this gives you some points of reference that you can take into your engagement in the readings and then the discussion about refugee as an area of activity, but as an area of politics. And remember that for your own advocacy around the ATCR, the state actors, the UNHCR actors, the NGO actors that you're going to be engaging with, and you need to convince, they know this history. They live these politics. So my hope is that by sharing this brief overview of the history and politics of refugee resettlement, you will be able to identify the interests and the actors that can be influenced and how the process of refugee resettlement can continue to evolve in providing solutions for the millions of refugees who need this solution. Thank you for watching this video. Take good care.